So we had some big news that came out today regarding loot boxes. The details for this story coming from The Verge by McKenna Kelly. So I'm going to summarize and then I'll read some quotes here. So the three major video game console manufacturers, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, they've come together and they have committed to making some changes to the way that loot boxes are used in games, in the sense that they've committed to requiring drop rates to be publicized. So if you purchase a loot box, you will have transparency to be able to see, okay, I've got a 1 in 2,500 chance that I'm going to get an epic item out of this loot box, or what have you. And this was actually announced today by the ESA, who we'll be speaking about more later on in the show, during a loot box workshop at the Federal Trade Commission. Has anybody had a chance to look into what this loot box workshop at the FTC was? I'm genuinely asking because I'm very curious. It seems like a bunch of suits sitting around and not understanding a goddamn thing that anybody up at the front is talking about. But so
Bill for real says he'd love to sit in on that loot box committee.
I guess. But this is going to include, and this list is straight from The Verge, Activision Blizzard, Bandai Namco, Bethesda, Bungie, EA, Take-Two Interactive, Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, and Wizards of the Coast. According to the ESA, other publishers are also considering the disclosure. They will need to be included for a game to be published on the Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo Switch consoles. Other platforms like PC are not included in this commitment. Here's the quote from the ESA, quote, "The video game industry relies on creating and sustaining relationships with our players based on fun, but just as importantly, on trust. One of the hallmarks of our industry is that we don't just create entertainment value for our players, we listen to them." End quote. There's no official word on the timing of these disclosures, but the company is hoping that they will roll out through 2020. So you guys can go check out the article from The Verge to read Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo's responses on this as well. But want to just get you guys' thoughts in general from the top. What do you think of, let's start with just the announcement about loot boxes, because Cody, I'm sure you have things to say about the ESA themselves coming out of this story. But from the perspective of just the way this impacts the market with loot boxes, what are your feelings and reactions?
I've wanted this for a long time. Like, if you're going to have an item people can spend real money on, like, I think you should have to disclose what their actual odds of winning are. So, yeah, like, I think it's a good move. I'm glad to see that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it addresses a lot of people's concerns about loot boxes. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think there are also other aspects of loot boxes that have yet to be addressed that people should still be concerned about. Namely, like, even if you do know the odds, kids having access to this stuff, or not just kids, minors in general, is kind of a problematic element of loot boxes. But I think for this announcement, I do think this is something that we've all been talking about for a while. It certainly removes a bit of the element of gambling from it if you know the odds. Or at least you can sort of game it as much as you want, or at least you know going into it, so you can choose to whether or not to spend money on it. It's definitely a step, and we'll talk about whether or not it's a big enough step to actually affect loot boxes writ large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with both of you, but especially with something Larry said of just like, if you're able to spend real money on something, you should be able to understand your chances of receiving the thing that you clearly hope to receive from that purchase. I mean, that's the that's a bare minimum requirement for the lottery. You know, you go and you buy a Powerball ticket, and you know you've got a 1 in however many million chance that you're gonna win money off of it. You know, you go to Vegas and you know the odds. Like, in any of these games of chance, those games are required to publicize your odds of winning. And so I think it's a good step forward. I think it is also clearly a reaction to the pressure that we've been seeing from governments around the world that are trying to regulate them. We've said it multiple times on this show that if if the games industry does not want the government to regulate loot boxes, they need to step in and begin regulating them. And I think that Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo clearly listen to this podcast and we're like, you know what, those guys make a hell of a good point. So yeah, I think it's a bare minimum of a step forward, though.
And if the FTC is having a committee on loot boxes, like the writing's on the wall there, like we're in the 11th hour of get your crap in order.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So yeah, we can kind of go beyond that now. Do you think this is going to? Obviously, the public sentiment around loot boxes is at a as low as it can probably be measured at the moment. You know?
Yeah, I would say so.
When a game says it comes out and it comes out and says it's going to have loot boxes in it, the backlash on that is, I think the only thing worse than saying you're going to have loot boxes is saying that you're going to go exclusively to the Epic Game Store.
Yes.
And so, do you think that this kind of change is going to have any kind of impact on that public sentiment?
The public sentiment around loot boxes?
Yeah.
I think people will still, it's so culturally ingrained in a lot of people to always rail against this stuff. Like the moment you hear microtransactions, it's like a dog whistle for a bunch of people. They immediately just start barking. I do think it'll go a long way toward, once it actually starts being implemented and isn't just talk, I think it will, over time, people will come to understand these things a little bit differently. If you know, again, like you guys are saying, if you know the odds of what you're buying into, you kind of tend to view it a little bit differently. I think a lot of people, loot boxes in particular, view it as a just kind of a, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get shitty stuff most of the time, and you don't really know what you're going to get the rest of the time. So I think it'll help alleviate that. I do think that people still on a philosophical level view loot boxes and microtransactions as something that they're just absolutely opposed to, just as a way to milk more money out of them. So I don't know if it'll curb that, but I think it'll certainly curb people's opinions of what they're doing when they go into buying loot boxes. I think there's people who will just don't buy them in general and probably won't sway them, but the people who do, or do occasionally, it might shift their opinion slightly.
Yeah, I think the word dog whistle's interesting there, because, and the idea that like people have a hard time separating the idea of loot boxes and microtransactions. Like it's one of those like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square kind of things. And so even if this shifts, because I do think that there is going to have to be a shift with a lot of companies in terms of the way that they craft their loot boxes around this change. I imagine if some of these companies were to publicize their current drop rates for certain items, they are going to be considerably laugh-worthy when it comes down to it. And so it's either going to force them to adjust and say, okay, well, we're going to make these a little bit more favorable to the players, or, well, if we make this more favorable to the players, it's not going to be nearly as advantageous to us, and so we're going to move on to another model. And so this change, I don't think is going to eliminate loot boxes to begin with, but even if it did, there's just going to be another kind of microtransaction that comes up that's going to just as heavily be just as heavily kind of railed against as loot boxes are.
Companies are always going to try to earn money hand over fist.
Yeah, especially when they've been doing it. When you're used to making that kind of money, you're not going to do anything that impacts your ability to continue to make that kind of money.
And people have bought into it. Like even though people complain, people still buy loot boxes.
Yeah. And Larry, I know you had to step away for a second. We're talking about whether or not this change is going to help to improve the public sentiment around loot boxes.
Yeah, to some degree, I think it will. Something, and I know you guys aren't opposed to this, but I do want to make it clear that we need to expect, for anyone that just outright thinks all microtransactions are bad, we can't expect a game like Overwatch to run 3, 4, 5, 6 years without any kind of expenditures. So the people that are just flat out opposed to those things altogether, like either either get used to the idea of more expensive games or get used to the idea of some kind of microtransactions. But we definitely want to make sure that it is like a fair and not predatory system.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that this does take some strides that way.
Yeah, because Overwatch is a great example because there's so much content that had Overwatch come out 6-7 years ago, we'd have been charged for every new map that came out. We'd have been charged for every new character that came out. Or the other alternative is, well, why isn't it that we can't just pay a flat rate for a skin that we want or something like that? Not recognizing that if they were to move in that direction, I mean, I know the Mercy skin was a skin to help raise money for charity, but think about how much they charged. What was it? Was it $20 for the skin?
I think it was something like that. Yeah.
I think it was $19.99 for that skin. And I'm not saying that's indicative of what every skin would cost, but in order for them to recoup the same amount of money they're probably making through the loot boxes, they're going to have to charge 12, 13, 14, 15 bucks for every legendary skin. And when you put it boldface in front of you, like, this is how much we're actually trying to get out of you with these loot boxes, there is a sticker shock to that. And, you know, they're going to get you one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But it also seems like more and more in this industry, companies are starting to move away from randomized loot boxes. In fact, today it was announced that when Rocket League's when Psyonix acquisition by, this is a weird way of saying this, but once Epic acquires Psyonix and Rocket League moves to the Epic store, they're going to be removing all randomized loot boxes from their game. This is similar to what what Epic did with Fortnite Save the World. There are no loot boxes in, I'm pretty sure there's no loot boxes in Fortnite Battle Royale, right? It's all like rolled, here's the 4 items that are for sale for the next 8 hours kind of thing, and you can just pay a flat rate for them, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
And the stuff you get in the season pass.
Yeah. So do you think that this is a trend that's starting to take care of itself, and that this is kind of a first move into companies really trying to figure out, okay, well, what's our next model?
Yeah, I think so. Just because I don't think you can get to the point where people don't feel icky about loot boxes, because that sentiment is so ingrained. Whether it's fair or not, the sentiment is ingrained. And if Fortnite in particular is demonstrating one thing, it's that they know how to monetize. Epic knows how to monetize the game. And so as Fortnite continues to be successful, I would expect a lot of people to begin to emulate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we've seen games outside of Fortnite have success with that model that they're using. The idea of, like, it's a season pass and you stay engaged and you move forward. I mean, Apex, to an extent, they do have randomized stuff that you can actually purchase the randomized boxes, correct? But for the most part, they're trying to recoup their money in the seasons. PUBG is making money hand over fist with the season pass model as well.
Do they still have the loot boxes too, though?
I'm sure they do still have the loot boxes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Apex has. Okay. Apex has the loot box, the whatever they're called, the Apex packs, but they also they've got the season pass, but they also have a store where you can spend currency. There are 3 types of currency in that game, and I think you can buy all 3. You can definitely buy 2 of the 3, and they go toward different things. So
yeah, I think I mean, it's the market moves where the consumers move, and as consumers get fed up with loot boxes and that word starts to have a negative connotation with your game, I mean, publishers will look to other models. I think this is a step towards trying to put some of the sheen back on loot boxes, just because, again, like we've said, that the sentiment around them is so overwhelmingly negative. Whether, like you said, Larry, whether it's earned or not is another thing, but there's a cultural reaction around the word loot box. And so I think this is a step towards obviously mollifying those concerns, and in the process, probably moving in a different direction as well. I don't know where that direction is. I'm not the best person to prognosticate about that particular market, but I think Fortnite's model obviously is working. So that's one way to go. I think there'll still be the hybrid models like Siege and Apex and Overwatch, or not Overwatch, but Siege and Apex that have seasons in addition to loot boxes. And I'm sure we'll see something we haven't even thought of or seen yet pop up in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think another interesting point is that I'm a big sports game fan, and for the most part, those games exist fully on randomized card packs with like FIFA Ultimate Team, Madden Ultimate Team, NBA's My Team. I don't feel like there's as much, not to say it's non-existent, but there's not as much negative sentiment around those things. In fact, like building your Ultimate Team in FIFA and Madden is seen as an event, and I'm curious. I can already start to see the articles being published on Kotaku and Polygon and Player versus All when we're looking at drop rates in those kinds of games where you're buying packs in the hopes of maybe finding like one or two really rare cards and figuring out how to like game the math. And is it better for me to buy 10, and I'm just making shit up, is it better for me to buy 10 platinum packs because I have X amount of chance, or is it better for me to buy 3 of these ultra platinum packs to have a chance at it? Like, we're going to start to see a lot of that happening, I think, especially in these sports games where people take those teams online to compete with them, and it really matters what players you're coming in with. And I'd be interested to hear from Beal for Real in the chat, who's big into the like deck building games.
I was going to say that's another huge place where it's going to take off.
Yeah, Hearthstone, Magic the Gathering, online. And again, those are a lot of those are PC games and won't be impacted by this, but you have to imagine PC's not going to be far behind on these kind of regulations.
Yeah. I also wonder with sports and particularly deck building games whether it's more normalized because of where those systems historically have come from. Like I remember buying packs of Magic cards and just knowing I'm going to get mostly shitty cards and then 1 or 2 rare cards. And just like I remember buying baseball cards and trading with my friends and knowing that I might not get what I want to get. Those are kind of historically embedded in like physical media, and we understand it that way to a certain extent. Obviously it's not the same, but I think it's interesting to note why people may have different perceptions of those as well.
Well, and not to mention that in FIFA Ultimate Team or, Gwent, it is the game. you know?
Yeah.
It's all about the game. Whereas it seems so like the sidecar to all of these other games, but yet it's such a big part of the push when you log into those games. Like, Overwatch, it's skins and voice lines and emotes and victory poses, like nothing that's actually impacting the gameplay, but it's so essential to keep the game afloat for these things to be bought. And it seems like this thing that more so takes away from the game rather than being the game itself. Yeah.
I remember talking with my friend about gaming Hearthstone's card packs, like how many you'd need to buy to get stuff. It's just kind of it's a normalized function of how those games work.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm sure that's not the last big change we're gonna be seeing from the loot box front, and so we're gonna stay on top of it. But let's and I'm sure we'll come back to a part of this conversation when we get to your topic.